the discussion here of what's going on with node implementations, software that can run Bitcoin nodes. 97% of the market share, or 90% of the nodes out there, 97% of the nodes out there run Bitcoin Core. And he personally has a connection to Bitcoin Knots, which is, I mean, it's an open source software. So he's actually, it's Luke Dasher that developed Bitcoin Knots, and it is identical to in the UX. Like, it looks the same when you operate Bitcoin Knots to Bitcoin Core, but there's additional features within there that they deem to be a benefit, which a lot of it is filters. So their idea is that arbitrary data that isn't financial.
Sorry, Forrest, before you go into that, can you
Sure.
explain the difference between knots and core? I feel like that just going into the fundamentals so people know what actually, can we start with what a Bitcoin implementation is? I think that's a good start.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So it's software that connects your device to the Bitcoin blockchain. And it's an open source software, and it's been developed from the beginning of Bitcoin's existence. And the early implementations of it, you could mine off of it right away as well, just through your PC, your computer. But miners, I mean, you can hash without running a node, but you really can't mine without running a node. So that's kind of the difference there, or at least that's what I've been told, and it makes sense to me too. So it connects you to the blockchain. It allows you to get new blocks in. It allows you to send transactions, sign transactions, see your transactions through your own mempool, which again is an open source software as well. You can create your own mempool. And essentially, because it's open source, you could download Bitcoin Core and you could fork it as a software, but still connect to Bitcoin's blockchain, but add in whatever additional things. You could change the logo. You could do whatever you want within the code, but still connect to Bitcoin's network. And that doesn't change anything about Bitcoin by forking it. Now, if a miner was to run Bitcoin Knots, and they just leave the default filters on, or they adapt the filters however they want, and if they were to mine a transaction or a block, then that their block would fundamentally potentially look different than a miner who's running Bitcoin Core because of those filters. So there might be some transactions or some transactions that would be filtered out and wouldn't be mined by that miner running Knots. And those transactions would have some sort of indicator that they weren't financial transactions. They were arbitrary data transactions. They were, somebody just putting in like a, there's all sorts of different ways to do this, but essentially there are people that want to put data into the Bitcoin blockchain for whatever reason they want. So whether it's because, I could put my birthday in there and say, hey, happy birthday to me. And then that's internalized, and everybody that runs a node now has that in there. So I'm storing that data on all these computers that run nodes. Or you could try to imprint a JPEG in there. And then you could try to sell that JPEG, say that it's like rare or whatever. And you could launder money by selling and buying these JPEGs over and over. Which is, something that happens. Or you could be really nefarious, and you could imprint something that's illegal, some data that's actually illegal. And then anybody that has a computer that's running that node, if you're crossing a border, if you get that computer searched and you have something illegal embedded into the database just from running a Bitcoin node, that could potentially be really, really bad, right? So, yeah. And then this all kind of leads into the op return situation, which is op return is just a part of the block that allows for non-transaction data to be included. And there's a limit of how much data can go into an op return. And Bitcoin Core has a proposal to change their implementation of Bitcoin Core to make that so that it's unlimited. Now, what that does is it doesn't make the block size bigger. It just makes the op return potentially take up more space within that block, and therefore it becomes more expensive. Like if that bloats up to the full size of the block, and it's all arbitrary data of people minting JPEGs or whatever, and you're trying to do a financial transaction in the transaction side of the block, it would become really expensive. If there's a big spam attack and a lot of people want to put data into the op return for some reason. So that's kind of part of the debate here, part of the problem, and that the op return, it's more expensive than putting data into the transaction side. So it's almost been like, okay, we know people are going to spam this. We know that there's going to be bad actors trying to use this to put data in. So we'll allow them to do it to some degree here in this op return. We'll make it more expensive so it's less likely, right? That's what Bitcoin has always been about, is making the miner fees, the transaction fees, even Hashcash was designed to be a spam filter for email. That's what Adam Back's original idea of Hashcash was. So to make it expensive to do a transaction limits the amount of people willing and able to do spam type transactions, and it keeps it more of a financial instrument, because that's the only value in something like this.
So can we talk more about why this is a threat to Bitcoin? So the way, from what I see, from what I understand, tell me if I'm right or wrong here. But from what I understand, basically, if there's no filter, there's going to be more, I guess, spam, things that
Junk.
aren't junk, uh, things that aren't financial transactions on the blockchain, and the people who are running nodes are going to have those uh, bits of spam and that junk on their nodes. And what'll happen is it'll become harder and harder to run a node. Is that accurate?
No,
Will it increase the size of a block or anything like that? No.
no, no. It's not going to increase the blockchain size. So
Okay.
it's different than like the 2017 like block size wars. It's not
Right. Oh,
increasing
so
the
the
block
chain
size.
blocks will stay the same. Okay. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
We should maybe, sorry to cut you guys off here. I think this is just so important for people to really understand. And the Bitcoin network itself, yes, you can send Bitcoin back and forth. People see it as money, but most importantly, it is just data. And when you're running a node, you're basically taking a copy of all that data since January 3rd, 2009, and you're keeping a copy of that. And so the more stuff that's on there, non-monetary, like it's one thing for me to send some Bitcoin to Forest and that gets recorded and put it into the Bitcoin blockchain. And I'm happy to do that. That's why I'm running a node, because I want a copy of the updated ledger every 10 minutes. But when people spam it and there's no limit on that spam, it becomes harder and harder and more expensive for the average person to run a node, which that's what Bitcoin, the block size wars were about. The more expensive it is, the more friction there is for the average person to be able to do that, the more centralized it becomes, because there's less people actually running a node. And that's, if you look at like Ethereum, some of the blockchains that don't have any sort of limit on it, it's impossible for the average person to do it because it's so expensive. You need like basically a data center, right? So with this, like I can run a node myself. I'm keeping a copy of the blockchain, but I think it's just important for people to visualize the Bitcoin network is just data. Every Bitcoin transaction is just data.
Yeah, and that's a big part of the argument from the other side of people that say, "Oh, this isn't a big deal. Bitcoin Core, go ahead. There's going to be spam no matter what." The idea is that the Bitcoin ledger and blockchain is just a database, and we're ascribing value to certain things of data, which are UTXOs. And yeah, it is just a database. But again, that video of Bitcoin Mechanic, he says that's like saying, you know, a jumbo jet and a tricycle are both transportation. They both serve different needs. So yeah, a database, a centralized cloud database makes a lot more sense to hold all of your movies than the Bitcoin blockchain, which is very expensive to hold data and has a different purpose than just cloud storage. Its purpose is a financial ledger, and it becomes less and less usable the more people have an alternate use case for the Bitcoin blockchain. And this potentially could allow for that other use case, which is arbitrary data storage.
So I think this was one of the reasons why when we during, let's say, when the halving happened, the transaction fees were so high. I think some of the blocks were getting like millions of dollars of transaction fees. And was this part of the reason for that?
That was because of something called Runes, which
Runes.
uses Taproot. I'm not. That's a bit of a knowledge gap for myself actually about
It's the
that.
same
But
idea though, right?
That's what I thought.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure if it uses Operaturn. I'm not sure how they're doing it, but there is some sort of. Actually, I believe it was maybe the. Oh, actually, I think the UTXO bloat happened in 2020. Actually, anyway, I'm not 100% sure, but it is kind of the same idea of trying to create some other type of value with arbitrary data within Bitcoin, and the spammers find exploits. So they found exploits through SegWit, they found exploits through Taproot, and yeah, Operaturn has been an exploit as well, but they've been able to just limit the amount of exploiting that's gone in there.
So I think what we want here is for okay. So that this is actually perfect. This issue is overblown and mostly noise. I think what we want here is um, we want the blockchain to have cheap transactions, and we don't want to have full blocks with just garbage transactions, right?
Yeah, it makes it
That's the
more
goal.
difficult to use for sure. Jor, I just sent you or presented a screen here.
Oh,
If you want to show that, this is a very good demonstration of why people think this is just noise and this isn't a big issue. So in 2024, this is the ordinals. That was the halving, or shit, was it the runes? Was it runes or ordinals? I can't remember at this point.
I think it was ruined.
I think it was, yeah. So you can see a huge amount of spike of spam, a huge amount of basically this chart is showing like arbitrary data included into the blockchain. And these things happen in waves because there becomes a lot of interest, a lot of, hey, we can speculate on this, we can make money from this, we can do this and then sell this to suckers at the table that think there's value in it. And then, of course, it fades. So right now you can see there's very little, this arrow here on the right shows very little amount of spam on the Bitcoin blockchain. And so it's like, why is it important to talk about this now? Like, what's the big deal, right? And the big deal is, in my opinion, is you don't want this to happen again. And there's the change in Operaturn on Bitcoin Core hasn't happened yet. So they're Mechanic and others are making a stand, a stand at an arbitrary line in history before anything happens, because it's probably easier to make a stand before something happens than after.
Yes.
Probably easier to make a stand when it isn't a big deal and actually make it so that a more positive outcome in their eyes happens. And yeah, again, he says this in his video, but like, the lines on maps are arbitrary as well, but we reinforce those over time because we see the value in creating those arbitrary lines. So again, this is just the idea of making a stand here before something else happens that could make Bitcoin less useful, which is the ultimate risk, in my opinion.
I think
Yes.
one of the worst things is that if this spam existed at some point, like we had that spam from 2024, that's going to be on people's nodes forever.
Yes. And the thing is too, is the additional spam, or like the UTXO set bloated in, I believe, 2020 or something like that. And if you're downloading a Bitcoin blockchain, it's incredibly quick until that point, and then it slows way down because there's so much more data in there that it becomes so much more intensive to your CPU, to your data, to your RAM, to your hard drive disk space, all of this stuff. And it actually makes like there's these original start nines, and you can't run them anymore. You can't run a node on them. You have to upgrade your hardware, and it's because of a spam attack that happened. And it makes it so that your hardware needs to be upgraded, and that makes it harder for people around the world to run nodes. And being able to run your own node is, if we all agree that that's the most important thing, then we should do as much as possible to make that as easy as possible.
So the threat here would be if okay, so the blocks stay the same size, but they could be smaller if the spam wasn't on there.
More financial transactions would fit into those limited size blocks.
But we saw, okay, so if blocks are partially empty, let's say for example we have more financial transactions, no spam. If blocks are not full, let's say a few weeks ago, I think we had blocks that weren't completely full, right? So that would take up less space on a node.
Yep.
Right? So that would mean that the Bitcoin blockchain would technically be smaller if the spam didn't exist.
I think potentially, but yeah, I mean, blocks are mostly full most of the
Mostly
time.
full.
So, but yeah, you could there's some nuance with that, right? Like if you're pushing out your financial transaction because of fees, because of spam on the network, that spam transaction still happens, plus your financial transactions happens on top of that, so that is going to make consistently full blocks constantly,
Right.
which will over time and maybe in a very small degree affect the size of the overall blockchain. I believe that's how it works. That part I'm a little bit unclear on, actually, personally, but
I think that's how it works too. So the way that I see it, okay, so the way that I see it, tell me if you guys think that what I'm saying is right here. The way that I see it, if these spam transactions exist, every block is going to be completely full. There's going to be more transactions on Bitcoin nodes. Less of them are going to be dedicated to just financial transactions just as a percentage, meaning that people are going to be storing junk on their computers, on their servers. And the reason why this is a threat is because it becomes harder for people to run a node from their house. And over time, the block will keep getting bigger, or the blockchain will keep getting bigger and bigger until at some point, the only way to run a node would be to have some kind of industrial warehouse to hold all your servers and the data. Is that right?
potentially, yes.
The block size wouldn't change though, right? Like it wouldn't actually be more data for people to store. It would just be that the people who actually want to use Bitcoin as it was designed to be as a monetary network, they're going to have to pay more fees because there's more spam and more people competing for that precious block space. So the people who actually want to use Bitcoin as it was made to be designed to be used, they're going to have to pay more, which over time, I think that will turn into a trend where people are like, well, I'm not going to pay this much to send a transaction because it doesn't really make sense. Whereas if people are using it specifically for monetary reasons, then yes, you still have the ability to bump up your fee to, increase your priority and get into the next block. But the fees aren't out of control. Just like when the ordinals and the runes were going on there, like nobody was sending Bitcoin. They were just, the miners were making bank. They were happy about it, but nobody was actually using Bitcoin the way it was designed to be used, which was peer-to-peer transactions with each other, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So there's arguments that block size needs to change in some way, size-wise, smaller or bigger. There's arguments on both. I think the having consistently full blocks isn't going to change or isn't going to cause a more of an issue for people running nodes, because it's already kind of baked in that's the size of the blockchain going forward. It's more that's maybe a secondary or third kind of issue. The first two major issues is that it makes it more expensive and more difficult to actually do real financial transactions, and the potential for spammers to inlay something harmful into the op return, because it's also serialized. Whereas other times, harmful data has been put into the blockchain. It's actually been all chopped up and doesn't actually relate to one specific thing.
So here's my question then, because this is maybe where I get a little bit confused myself, because I know that the block size is limited, and I think that that's very important for people to understand. And I saw a comment here before I go further into that. I saw Tom said, we should all learn more about the spam wars and we can build consensus that way. I think the reason why we're having this conversation today, like none of us claim to be experts in this manner. I think it's just more of a conversation where we can kind of understand it as like average people, not people who have been here for 15 years and are super technical. And just being aware that these things happen and they're going to continue to happen in the future. And we have to be kind of equipped for when that happens. But a side note on that is that where I get confused is like, I know that there's a block size limit, and each block size I think is like 4 megabytes or something. Some of it's Taproot allows a little bit more, but I don't know if these op return transactions are actually competing with that. Like I feel like that's almost another part of it where you could still have the same amount of like actual transactions, like monetary transactions or valid transactions, whatever you want to call them. But then all this op return stuff is just kind of like added to it. And what Bitcoin Core wants to do here is make that unlimited. So it would make it more expensive and take up more space for the people who are running nodes and who are using Bitcoin Core for that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Like
So right
people
now,
can spam the network and completely get rid of people's ability to transact using op returns, but it would just make it more storage and more difficult for the average person to run, right? Like, am I wrong there?
so my understanding of it is that op return has a cap right now of 1 megabyte of the
Okay.
total block space. So if there's 4 megabytes with SegWit, 1 megabyte could be taken up by op return data, and then so there's still 3 megabytes basically for transactions or whatever it ends up roughly being. If it becomes unlimited, then all 4 megabytes could be taken up by op return, and there would be no financial
Okay. So it
transaction.
is then.
Yeah.
So it is direct competition with financial then, right?
Yeah.
Is that kind of
Yeah.
what I'm getting from it?
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. So that does seem like a huge issue then.
It's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. I'm not sure why people. I mean, there's people out there that are just like, oh, well, people should be able to do whatever they want. Like freedom maximalists that say, oh,
Right.
people should be able to do whatever they want on the Bitcoin blockchain, which is I think is kind of a bad argument. It's like, yeah, but you're doing something. You're doing whatever you want, and you're forcing everybody else that wants to use this for financial means to hold that data and to make it less useful for financial transactions, which is what the use case of Bitcoin really is, if we actually look at it. And there's other places you can go mess around with images of cats and stuff. Just go do that somewhere else. Like that's the kind of the thing. And a lot of the people pushing for the op return or for the vulnerabilities within the block to be able to put spam in, if you look into their history, they're pretty connected into other places and other blockchains and other stuff that they want to be able to sell these images or whatever that they're making and putting into spaces.
Do you think
But
they could also
yeah.
have? Do you think they'd also have some kind of link with miners who get paid more in transaction fees if
Yeah.
the
full?
bullshit is
So that's the
yeah.
other thing too, right? Like large miners that are just trying to make a buck, that don't necessarily care about the longevity of Bitcoin as a financial system. Yeah, I mean, they're going to get paid more if there's more more data within the blocks, and the blocks are full. And if people are competing for blocks, then the fees go way up, right? Block space. So yeah, miners. I mean, if you look at 2024 when runes or ordinals or whatever it was came out, the fees were insane. They were making so much money off of fees, these miners that mined the blocks. So yeah, there's a lot of incentive to make money, fiat money, from disrupting the use case of Bitcoin and co-opting it for a different use case.
Yeah, I think this is mostly for people who don't see Bitcoin's future. So somebody asked, what is a legitimate transaction? I think that was a question there.
That's a fantastic question.
The way that I see it, the way that I see it, let me know what you guys think. So the question is, so it's from Curious Bitcoin. What's a real financial transaction? It was sent at 2:21 if you want to highlight it, Jor.
Okay.
But the question is, what's a real financial transaction? I would say a real financial transaction is where you're exchanging value for value. You're giving somebody Bitcoin for something that they did off the chain. So let's say if you let's say they give you US dollars and you give them Bitcoin. That's a legitimate transaction to me because they're giving you something off the chain. They're not giving you back some other Bitcoin. They're just giving you something off the chain so they could give you a good, a service. Let's say you want to buy groceries. That's a legitimate transaction. If you want to go to a rancher and buy some meat, that's a legitimate transaction. If you're putting through transactions to create runes, to create shit coins on top of Bitcoin, to create junk on the on the blockchain. I think those are not legitimate transactions because you're speculating on the value of what you're doing with that transaction. I don't know. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree with you. Those are legitimate transactions. I think there are other maybe nuanced ones as well, like consolidating your UTXOs. That's a financial transaction as well. The other argument here that is really silly is Satoshi embedded information within the first block. He didn't use op return. He actually used the Coinbase and inscribed Chancellor on second bailout for banks or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Chancellors on brink of second bailout for banks is what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but was that, was that arbitrary data? I actually think that it served a really great purpose. It dated the first block of Bitcoin and proved that there wasn't Bitcoin before that. Maybe there's a use case for that. I don't know, but like in today's age, I'm not sure. But I think that people need to argue these things. I think people need to argue what is a financial transaction, what is the use case of this. I think this discourse is amazing, and I think that if you're looking at this too, the answer to it, and it's a constantly building answer, is filters. But then, do these filters ever end up filtering out a legitimate transaction that might look, for whatever reason, suspicious and not, right? So where do you balance these things? A permissionless network, does it become less permissionless if there are filters and you can't do whatever you want on this blockchain? Again, this is why this discussion is so important, is because we need to figure these things out, and we need to constantly figure these things out with Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think my answer to that would be very similar to you guys. I agree with every word that you said. I think the main thing for me, and the reason why I would be concerned about this, is that to me, there's a big difference between somebody actually wanting to inscribe something. Like one of the, I think, most underappreciated things of the Bitcoin network is once you have a transaction in there, be it monetary or otherwise, and it gets put into a block, it's there forever. And nobody can go back and change that. And I think the one problem we've had as a civilization here is the fact that history happens and history can be deleted, history can be changed. Whereas when you have something decentralized like Bitcoin, and you can put something into that, that's going to live there forever. And I think that that's really going to reshape how different our future is going to be. Like, imagine if we had information from hundreds of thousands of years ago that could not be deleted or destroyed or burned down. Like, that's powerful. And I think that that's how civilizations really advance. So I think that there should be space for that. And that's kind of what exists today. As Forrest said there, 1 megabyte out of 4 megabytes, you can do that if you want to. You still have to pay for it, but you can. The problem becomes is when people want to attack the Bitcoin network with spam, and that's all that's in there, that's a problem. Because if there's enough spam, just like anything, you stop using it. If you're looking at a Twitter thing or a thread and it's all just spam, people just stop looking. And I feel like that's what would happen with Bitcoin, is that if it was all spam, people would stop using it for what it was designed to be. It would be more expensive, and people would actually lose the plot here, which is it is a way to exchange value peer-to-peer to anybody else on the planet. So that's what a financial transaction is to me. And I think that the problem and the worry to me is that if we make it unlimited and people have enough capital, people still have the ability to print money. And if they really wanted to stop Bitcoin, they could spam it. And there's really nothing that you could do about it at that point. Once that change has been implemented, that's a big problem.
Yeah. And I'll just quickly add to that. The 1 megabyte limit on op return could be viewed as a type of filter. And there has been filters on Bitcoin throughout time. So the filter argument of saying, oh, this is that and whatever, we just need to figure out the balance of that. That's the only thing.
I wanted to say, can you share my screen there, Jor?
Yep.
I believe in early January of 2025, the percentage of computers running, or the percentage of nodes running knots, was at 0.3%. I saw that from a tweet. Today, wow. It shows up at 3.5%. I'm not sure if this is accurate. Keep that in mind. I don't know, but it's up a lot. Even this morning, this was at 3.3, I think, 3.3%.
Yeah. Yeah. So when this debate started, I have a post from April 28th. It was 2.46.
There you go.
2.46. So it's increasing like crazy. And that's the other thing here that, I posted this. I retweeted this and just said, look, you could not understand any of this stuff with op return, any of that, if you value the decentralization of this network. It makes sense that one implementation of software that connects you to the blockchain shouldn't be 97% of it. We just need to decentralize even that aspect of it. So might as well run knots if you're a pleb. It's as simple as that, in my opinion.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that the thing that's going to happen, I think, in terms of my vision of the future here, is if you think about, just being how early we are right now, like think about when people started first buying Bitcoin, right? Like there was a couple different exchanges. I think it was Mt. Gox, Coinbase might have been in there afterwards, but it was the same kind of thing. It was very centralized. And I think the reason why Bitcoin Core today has the majority of that share is because they were kind of the first ones. They were the only ones that really existed. You started running a node, kind of just common knowledge within Bitcoin was like, yeah, download Bitcoin Core without really even knowing it. So it's not like I intentionally chose to do that. That's just kind of what the education that I took in was to do. So if you look at what's happened since then, Mt. Gox, Coinbase, there's thousands of exchanges now. And I think that in the future, there's going to be thousands of, different softwares that run, thousands of different miners that run instead of just like a couple big ones. I think over time, but I think it's still very important to understand this because we could come to an inflection point here in Bitcoin, whether this is one or not. We have to be prepared, we have to be equipped, and we have to be able to have conversations about it without people getting all butthurt by it. So I think the purpose of today's was just not to tell you Bitcoin Core or not, point out the issues with it, and just start having these conversations and help people who are holding Bitcoin and wanting to contribute to this network have a better understanding of what this thing really, the power that we have as people running Bitcoin nodes, essentially.
Absolutely. Well said, Jor.
So with that, we got a super chat here and kind of a follow-up to this, which is from Nav. So Nav sent him $5. Thank you, Nav. And says, this whole fiasco got me confused on what to run a node with, knots or core.
Yeah, I would just say you could run either. There again, the UX of knots is identical. Connecting it to Sparrow or Electrum or something like that is very, very easy. And again, for the decentralization of the software out there, I would personally run knots just for that reason alone. But I also am leaning towards the side of saying I don't really fully agree with the changes to the core implementation. So yeah, but again, you could run either. It's okay to run either, ultimately.
And this hasn't been put into place yet, right? This is just kind of being proposed right now.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Yeah.
And I'm going to piggyback off Forrest there. I think that I currently run Bitcoin Core. I'm somebody who just got into Bitcoin running my own node about half a year ago now. So that was that's kind of the default there was Bitcoin Core. That's what people who I trusted told me to download. And there was no issues because they were very similar between Core and Knots up until now. So I think that I will probably switch to Knots as well, strictly because I believe that it should be 50-50 instead of 90-3 or 95-3. So, unless one of them really does something that really pisses me off or vice versa, then I'll choose. But I think just specifically for decentralization at this point, I am going to start running Knots instead of Core.
Yeah,
so I want to ask you guys.
I started running Knots a month ago. I was running Core before that. Go ahead, Rashad.
I want to ask you guys a question. So let's say, for example, you run Knots versus Core. And let's say Core doesn't have the filters, but Knots does. Is the filter just what you're storing on your own device?
So there's a couple different things. It's what you actually see within your mempool. So it takes up less space in that way. And then
what you're storing.
Kind of, yes. Yeah. And also what you would potentially mine if you were a miner too. So it's probably much more important for miners to be running this, in my opinion. Yeah.
Okay, so if miners were to run Knots, then they're going to have a choice of what to filter out. And if there's spam transactions, they may just ignore them.
Yeah.
But then somebody else is going to pick them up later.
Yep. But for that block, there's maybe more space for non-financial transactions. Like that's what, Ocean is a pool that runs Knots, I believe. But also it allows each miner to build their own template, their block template. So they could include, even if you're mining through Ocean, you could include spam transactions if you wanted, because you have freedom to design your own block template as a miner. Right? Yeah. But yeah, it gets included later on. But again, if it was more 50-50, right? So there would be, all these miners mining with Knots and filtering out that stuff. And then, yeah, they'd get included later on, but there would be these pockets of openness for ease of financial transactions, lowering the cost for actual financial transactions as opposed to spam for the ones that are mined with miners that are running Knots. That's, again, my basic understanding of this. I definitely need to there's little knowledge gaps I have here for sure.
Yeah, and it's important to communicate that with people. And I think that part of these things coming up, and I don't think it's by design, but the nice thing about these little feuds between Bitcoiners is that it opens up the conversation for people, and it helps people gain a better understanding of exactly what's happening here. Because if none of this happened and everything kind of was just going, as per usual, then nobody's going to ever take the time to learn about this stuff. And then something's going to happen, and then everybody's going to be caught off guard, and then we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So I think that these things are going to come up, these little hurdles along the way, and I think that we should actually just use these as good opportunities to start learning a little bit more into Bitcoin and why it is so powerful.